Russia's non-Western trade volume hit a record in 2024. Not recovered, not stabilized, a record. That number is the cleanest way to see that the isolation thesis, repeated in every Western newspaper, every policy brief, every sanctions announcement since February 2022, was either wrong from the start or wrong now. Either way, someone has been reading this situation incorrectly, and the consequences of that misreading are not theoretical. The conventional framing runs like this. Russia invaded Ukraine. The West responded with the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history. Russia was cut off from global finance and trade, and the economic pressure would eventually produce either a policy change or a collapse. That framing is still the operating assumption behind most Western policy discussion. It is also 3 years old and has not produced either outcome it promised. What actually happened is more instructive. Russia did lose access to Western financial infrastructure. SWIFT disconnection for major banks, asset freezes, technology export controls. Those were real. The disruption in early 2022 was real. But disruption and isolation are different conditions, and treating them as identical is where the analysis went wrong. Russia's trade reorientation did not begin in March 2022. The Russian government published a document in 2015, the Foreign Policy Concept, updated again in 2023, that explicitly named reduced dependence on Western financial systems as a strategic objective. The Eurasian Economic Union, formalised in 2015, was the first structural move. The expansion of bilateral currency swap arrangements with China, which began in earnest after the 2014 Crimea sanctions, was the second. By the time the 2022 sanctions hit, Russia had been running contingency architecture for 8 years. 7 trade corridors are now operational or in advanced development. The North-South transport corridor running from Russian ports through Iran to the Indian Ocean. The expanded rail links through Kazakhstan and into Western China. The Arctic Sea Route, which Russia has been developing under Rosatom's logistics division since 2018. The Belarus-China overland connection. The corridor through Azerbaijan that bypasses both Western and Russian choke points depending on the cargo direction. The expanded Gulf transit arrangements through the UAE. And the direct Russia-India shipping lanes that moved over $60 billion in trade last year alone. Each of these corridors has a different ownership structure, a different currency settlement mechanism, and a different political logic. That variation is not accidental. It means no single Western countermeasure can close all of them simultaneously, because they were not built as a unified system. They were built as a distributed one. Distributed architecture is harder to sanction than centralised architecture. Russia's planners understood that. Western policymakers appear to have not. The figure worth holding: India's crude oil imports from Russia went from under 2% of India's total in 2021 to over 40% by late 2023, according to the International Energy Agency's oil market report. That shift happened inside 18 months. The speed matters because it tells you the supply chains were not built from scratch. They were activated. Infrastructure that already existed was repurposed. Russia's geographic isolation is real. Its economic isolation is a category error dressed as a policy objective. The 7 corridors are not the story. The story is that they were planned before anyone in the West started counting them. And that gap between what was built and what was noticed is exactly where this analysis begins. The North-South transport corridor did not appear in Western policy discussion until 2023. Russia and Iran signed the foundational agreement in 2002. That 20-year gap between signature and Western attention is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of analytical priority. The corridor existed on paper, moved modest freight, and sat outside the frame of what Western analysts considered strategically relevant. Then sanctions made it relevant. And suddenly, a 2-decade-old infrastructure project looked like a sudden geopolitical manoeuvre. It was not sudden. That distinction matters for everything that follows. The corridor runs approximately 7,000 kilometres, from Russian Baltic ports south through Moscow, down to Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea, across by ship to Iranian ports, then onward by rail to the Persian Gulf and Mumbai. Transit time from St. Petersburg to Mumbai via this route is roughly 25 days. The Suez Canal route runs closer to 40. Russia is not just rerouting trade, it is offering a faster option to Indian importers. And Indian importers have noticed. The currency layer underneath this is where the mechanism becomes difficult to counter. Transactions along the north-south corridor are increasingly settled in rubles, rupees, and Iranian rials, with the ruble-rupee exchange handled through a bilateral arrangement between the Reserve Bank of India and the Bank of Russia that was formalised in July 2022. That arrangement does not touch the US dollar. It does not touch SWIFT. It operates on a parallel rail that Western financial infrastructure cannot reach without sanctioning India directly, which carries costs the US has consistently judged too high to bear. This is the structural logic that runs through all 7 corridors. Each one sits in a jurisdiction or crosses through jurisdictions where the cost of Western countermeasures exceeds what Western governments are currently willing to pay. The UAE processed an estimated $300 billion in trade in 2023, a significant portion of which involved Russian origin goods moving under third country documentation. The US Treasury sanctioned several UAE-based entities. The UAE did not change its posture. That tells you where the leverage actually sits, and it does not sit with Washington in the way the isolation thesis requires. China's role deserves precision here because it is frequently overstated in one direction and understated in another. China is not running Russia's sanctions bypass operation. China is running its own trade expansion, and Russia happens to benefit from the infrastructure that expansion requires. The rail corridors through Kazakhstan into Xinjiang were built to serve Chinese export interests into Central Asia and Europe. They also carry Russian freight. Beijing did not build them for Moscow. Moscow uses them because they exist and because the alternative is worse. That distinction matters because it means Chinese cooperation is structural, not political, which makes it harder to disrupt through diplomatic pressure. What I keep coming back to is the IMF's own data on this. The IMF's October 2023 World Economic Outlook projected Russian GDP growth at 2.2% for 2023. The Russian economy, under what Western officials described as the most severe sanctions in history, grew. The IMF projection was not a defense of Russian policy. It was a measurement. And what it measured was an economy that had absorbed the shock, rerouted its trade, and resumed expansion. The gap between the sanctions narrative and that number is not a rounding error. It is the size of the entire analytical failure. The Arctic Sea route adds a dimension the other corridors lack. Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear corporation, was handed logistics authority over Arctic shipping in 2018, under Federal Law 525. That was 4 years before the invasion. Rosatom now operates the icebreaker fleet, the port infrastructure, and the transit licensing for the Northern Sea route. Freight volumes along that route doubled between 2021 and 2023, according to Rosatom's own published statistics. The destination is overwhelmingly Asian, Chinese and South Korean ports receiving Russian LNG, coal, and containerized goods. A nuclear corporation running a trade corridor is not an improvisation. It is a long-term infrastructure decision wearing the clothes of a sanctions response. The 7 corridors share one design principle. They each require a different diplomatic relationship to close. That is not a coincidence. That is an architecture. And someone drew the blueprints before the invasion gave them a reason to. The counter-argument deserves honest treatment because it is not weak. Russia's trade reorientation is real. The corridors exist. The volumes are measurable. But several serious analysts, including those at the Kyiv School of Economics and the Yale Chief Executive Leadership Institute's Sanctions Tracking Project, have argued that the ruble's structural weakness, the technology import gap, and the long-run demographic drain tell a different story than the trade volumes alone. Their position is that Russia has found workarounds for commodity exports, but cannot solve the import side of the equation, specifically the precision components, semiconductor inputs, and dual-use technology that a war economy requires at scale. That argument has substance. Take it seriously before dismissing it. Russia's imports of advanced semiconductors collapsed in 2022. The Bureau of Industry and Security's export control expansion, covering chips, electronic components, and manufacturing equipment, created a genuine supply shock. Russian domestic production cannot substitute at volume. The workarounds through third countries, Armenia, Turkey, Kazakhstan, are real but imperfect. The chip grades arriving through those channels are, in many documented cases, 1 or 2 generations behind what Russian defence manufacturing actually needs. The Royal United Services Institute published detailed technical analysis in 2023, tracing components recovered from downed Russian weapons systems. And the picture is of an industrial base making do, not one that has solved the problem. So the counter-argument holds on the technology import side. Russia has a component problem it has not fully resolved. The question is whether that problem is fatal to the corridor's argument. And the honest answer is no, for a reason the counter-argument underweights. Russia's 7 trade corridors were not built primarily to solve the technology import problem. They were built to solve the revenue problem, specifically to keep hydrocarbon export revenues flowing regardless of Western financial infrastructure. On that objective, they have succeeded. Russia's oil and gas revenues in 2023 came in above the Finance Ministry's own budget projections, according to the Russian federal budget execution data published in January 2024. The war is being financed. The corridors are doing the job they were designed to do, which was never to replace Western semiconductor supply chains. Those are 2 separate problems with 2 separate solutions at 2 separate stages of development. Conflating them produces the false conclusion that because Russia has not solved problem B, it must also be failing at problem A. The strain points in the corridors are real but specific. The north-south corridor through Iran runs into port capacity constraints at Bandar Abbas, Iran's main Persian Gulf terminal, that have not been resolved despite 2 years of stated intent to expand throughput. The ruble-rupee settlement mechanism hit a documented problem in mid-2023 when Indian banks accumulated rupee surpluses they could not efficiently repatriate, creating a temporary bottleneck that slowed Russian export receipts. These are not trivial frictions. They are the kind of operational problems that compound over time if left unaddressed. The Arctic route has a ceiling set by icebreaker availability. Rosatom's fleet is finite. The projected expansion to 200 million tonnes of annual freight by 2030, a target stated in Russia's Arctic strategy document, requires nuclear icebreaker construction that is currently behind schedule, according to shipyard reporting from the Zvezda facility in Bolshoi Kamen. Behind schedule is not cancelled, but the gap between ambition and delivery is where external pressure can apply. The honest conclusion here is that the isolation thesis failed because it was measuring the wrong thing. Western sanctions were calibrated to cut Russia off from the global financial system, and they did, partially. But Russia's economy does not require full integration into the global financial system to fund a land war in a neighbouring country. It requires sufficient commodity export revenue, sufficient import access for critical war materials, and sufficient domestic consumption stability to avoid political crisis. On all 3 metrics, the corridors have performed well enough. Not perfectly, well enough. That distinction between a system that is stressed and a system that has failed is exactly what most coverage collapses. Stress is visible and measurable. Failure is the conclusion that produces a satisfying narrative. Russia's trade architecture is stressed. It has not failed. And those 2 conditions require entirely different policy responses. The policy consequence of getting the isolation thesis wrong is not abstract. 3 years of Western strategy have been calibrated around an assumption that economic pressure would either compel a Russian policy change or degrade Russian warfighting capacity to the point of strategic failure. Neither has happened at the pace or scale the thesis required. That does not mean sanctions had no effect. It means the effect was insufficient for the strategic objective. And those are different conclusions with different implications for what comes next. When a strategy fails to produce its objective, the honest response is to ask why. The answer here is structural. The sanctions regime was designed for a globally integrated Russian economy, one that needed Western financial rails, Western technology markets, and Western trade relationships to function. That economy existed in 2013. By 2022, it had been partially dismantled by Russian planners, who read the 2014 Crimea response as a preview and spent 8 years reducing exposure. Sanctions designed for 2013 Russia were applied to 2022 Russia. The mismatch was built in before the first measure was announced. The 7 corridors are not just a Russian story. They are a demonstration effect, visible to every government currently calculating its own exposure to Western financial leverage. What other capitals took from 2022 is not that sanctions are powerful. What they took is that sanctions are avoidable with sufficient preparation time. That lesson is now inside the strategic planning of governments in the Gulf, in Southeast Asia, and across Latin America. The infrastructure investments those governments are making, in alternative payment systems, in bilateral currency arrangements, in trade corridors that bypass dollar-denominated settlement, are not reactions to Russian sanctions. They are insurance policies written in response to seeing how Russian sanctions worked and where they did not. The Belt and Road Initiative's expansion into Central Asia and the Middle East, the BRICS payment system discussions that moved from theoretical to operational between 2022 and 2024, the Indian UPI system's cross-border expansion, the Saudi Arabia-China yuan oil settlement trials. None of these are Russian projects. All of them benefit from the same structural logic the Russian corridors exposed, that dollar-denominated trade infrastructure is a choke point, and choke points invite circumvention by anyone with sufficient incentive and planning horizon. Russia did not create this dynamic. Russia demonstrated it at scale, under pressure, in real time. That demonstration will have a longer shelf life than the war that produced it. My read on this is that the isolation thesis was never primarily an economic prediction. It was a political communication strategy that got mistaken for an analytical framework. Telling domestic audiences that Russia was isolated served a purpose inside Western political systems. It sustained coalition support, justified the cost of energy disruption, and framed the conflict as one the West was winning, by means other than direct military engagement. The problem is that political communication strategies and analytical frameworks have different relationships with evidence. One is updated when evidence changes. The other is maintained because updating it carries political cost. Western governments chose the political cost calculation. The corridors kept opening. The 7 corridors will not save Russia from every consequence of its own decisions. The technology import gap is real. The demographic drain from emigration and casualties is real. The long-run fiscal pressure from sustained military expenditure is real. A country can route its oil revenues through 7 corridors and still make strategic errors that compound over a decade. Those things are not mutually exclusive. What the corridors foreclosed is the clean outcome the isolation thesis promised, the economic collapse that would force a reckoning. That outcome is off the table. What remains is a longer, more expensive, more structurally complicated contest between 2 economic architectures, one built around dollar primacy and Western institutional access, one being assembled corridor by corridor across the Eurasian landmass. That contest will not be decided by the next sanctions package. It will be decided by which architecture more governments find more useful over the next 20 years. The answer to that question is not yet settled. But the fact that the question is genuinely open after the most comprehensive sanctions campaign in modern history tells you more about where global economic power is actually moving than any official statement from either side has been willing to say directly. If this kind of analysis is what you come here for, the next script goes somewhere the corridor story leads that most coverage still has not reached.